Okay, so in yesterday's video I started the process of making prosciutto. And prosciutto is not cooked meat, so to make prosciutto you just take the pork leg and you encase it in salt for a month and then you take it out and hang it up to dry in a cool place for like half a year to 2 years. So today I'm going to do something a little bit different, but also a little bit the same. It's also a project in meat preservation, but it's going to use a different method and also a different piece of meat. So what I want to make is pastrami. And if you haven't had pastrami, again, I recommend that you go find like a pastrami burger or something. You will not regret it. What it is fundamentally is it's a cut of beef that has been brined and seasoned and then smoked. So if you watch the prosciutto video, you know that the way you cure prosciutto is by casing it in salt. And what the salt does is it sucks moisture out of the pork leg and kills bacteria. It's sort of like a forced dehydration. So to make the pastrami, we're going to do the exact same thing, except instead of dry curing it, instead of casing it in salt, instead of burying it in salt, what I'm going to do is I'm going to dunk it in brine for a week. So here's my brine, super simple, super basic. It's just a pot full of a gallon of water, a cup and a half of salt, a cup of sugar, and some garlic for seasoning. There's also Prague powder #1 in here. If you watch the prosciutto video, you know that Prague powder, either in #1 or #2, is a really important ingredient in curing, otherwise you're liable to get botulism. Ordinary table salt will not prevent botulism, Prague powder will. And what I'm using is actually Prague powder #1. It has sodium nitrite, but not sodium nitrate. It's better for short-term curing projects like a week-long bath in brine. Normally brisket is used for pastrami. I'm not using brisket, instead I'm using a B5 round. Reason being, I did not want to buy a whole brisket on the very first time I'm making this. Now, the brine is going to work in a really similar way to the dry curing that I used with the prosciutto. The salt and sugar in the brine is going to suck moisture right out of the chunk of meat, and it's not going to let bacteria grow. Now, some recipes call for boiling the brine, and some recipes don't call for boiling the brine. As far as I can tell, boiling the brine would just help the salt and sugar dissolve better, and then also kill any bacteria that somehow have made it into the brine. Now, I did boil this brine, but I doubt that it's absolutely necessary, simply because you can dissolve the salt and sugar in the water anyway, even if you don't boil it, and even if there are any kind of bacteria in there, in theory, the salt should be killing it anyway. I mean, that's the premise of this whole thing. Now, there's one other really key step here, which is to put some kind of weight or some kind of wedge on top of the meat. The meat has to be completely submerged in the brine. If any of the meat pokes out of the brine and is exposed to air, then that piece of meat is going to get covered in bacteria, and it's going to grow and multiply and take over your food. Traditionally, some kind of weight, like a board or a stone, was put on top of it. Instead, I'm just going to use a piece of plastic that will keep it down underneath the surface after I put the lid on. So you might be thinking, well, wait a second, Joseph, I wasn't born yesterday. I know all about pastrami, and I know the pastrami has to be refrigerated even after you finish preparing it. Now, this is absolutely correct. I suspect the pastrami ought to be more resistant to mold and bacteria, even after it's cooked, just because of the high salt content in there that is going to be destroying bacteria. However, it is also true that brine, and to a lesser extent smoking, are a preservation method for meats. Smoking actually adds a very thin acidic layer to the outside of the meat, which helps prevent the growth of bacteria, and then of course it also partially dries out the meat, which, just as with beef jerky or any other dehydrated meat, helps to inhibit bacterial growth. The brine mixture, though, is the really cool thing to me that I'm interested in. Because in theory, you should be able to submerge pieces of meat in the brine and keep them there for a really, really long time. Instructions that I've read online have said you ought to switch out the brine every month and you want to watch it for any growth of mold. But in principle, that brine should effectively refrigerate the cut of meat. It should absolutely massacre any bacteria that get in there and inhibit and prevent the growth of bacteria on the meat itself. I'm not totally sure about the historical details. I do know that brine has been used to preserve meat, particularly in barrels and particularly on sea voyages. This is kind of the way I imagine it, is imagine you are going on a long sea voyage on an old-time wooden sailing ship, and you want to bring some meat along the way. You want to eat some meat. So how are you going to do that? Well, fresh meat is right out. You can't refrigerate it. You could bring animals on board and butcher them as you go, but you're going to have to feed the animals, you need a place to keep them, and you know, animals when they're alive are just a little harder to take care of than a piece of meat is. You could also dehydrate the meat, but that's going to be time consuming, so it might not be a very good option. Now, as with the prosciutto, you could also dry pack it in salt, but that's going to take a lot of salt. To case the pork leg to make the prosciutto, I needed roughly 3 or 4 gallons of salt. That is a ton of salt. To cover this roast, however, I only needed a cup and a half of salt dissolved into a brine. So not only is it going to be a more efficient use of your salt, but you're also going to be able to do it immediately. You take your fresh meat, you throw it directly into the barrel, you cover it in brine, and you're set. Now, instructions I've read online lead me to believe that you can do this for a really long time. How long, I don't know. Months? Years maybe? Not sure exactly. What I've read is that you want to switch out the brine about every month and then also be monitoring it just to make sure that there's no mold or any bacterial growth or scum on the surface. But in principle, I could brine this cut of meat for months before eventually smoking it into pastrami. And that to me is the miracle of brining, the miracle of wet curing, is the fact that, you know, in a week I can have something that's kind of like fresh meat, that can be cooked like fresh meat, and yet I didn't have to refrigerate it. It gives you a little bit of perspective into how valuable salt was. You might be aware that salt has been used as currency before. In fact, it's where we get our word salary. Salt is valuable. Salt is the difference between having delicious pastrami in a week and having a 500-pound cow that you don't know what to do with. So with that, I'm going to let my beef roast just sit here in the brine for a week, and we will come back and smoke it. Okay, so now I am opening up the brined beef, and again, I've left this chunk of beef in brine for about 3.5 weeks. Originally, I'd only planned on doing it for about a week, but you know, one thing happened and another thing happened, and it ended up being 3.5 weeks. And I'm actually pretty happy about that because that means that I got to test, you know, how well the brining works over the course of time. And so you can see this is what the piece of brined beef looks like. And there's also this kind of reddish patch underneath that it looks like there was a vacuum seal on the bottom of the container. As you open the container, you can smell a really strong garlic smell, which is good. And it doesn't look like there's any obvious signs of rot. There's nothing about this that I look at and say, okay, this is obviously spoiled. Even that chunk there that, you know, clearly wasn't brined properly, I'm guessing it was cut off completely from oxygen. I doubt that there's any serious bacterial growth. And there's nothing about it that smells rotten. All I smell is ordinary raw meat. And you got to remember, so I left it outside for 3.5 weeks, and it is winter, and sometimes the temperature was above freezing, and sometimes it was below freezing. So, you know, sometimes it was refrigerated outside. But even at refrigeration temperatures, you should not leave a piece of raw meat in the refrigerator for that long. You should not leave a piece of raw meat in the refrigerator for 3.5 weeks. So I consider this, as long as it doesn't kill me when I eat it, to be a pretty good proof of concept of this idea of brining meat. And I would say at this stage of the proceedings, I can look at this and say, hey, look, it looks like this brining thing works, and that if we swapped out the brine you know, every 3 or 4 weeks, that we could probably keep this for quite a while. So that's food preservation by brining. The next stage is going to be to cover it in spices and smoke it. Remember that the brine already had garlic in it, and now this spice blend is black pepper, coriander, paprika, and a little bit of cloves. Where I'm actually going to smoke it is in this fireplace. Now, I could have used our smelt furnace to smoke it, and that would have been great too. But I wanted to use this indoor fireplace for a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm curious to see what happens. How practical is it to smoke foods inside of an indoor wood fireplace? Another reason that I wanted to do it this way is because it's not something that is commonly done anymore. If you do cook food inside, you do it over an electric or a gas stove. And if you ever do cook food over a wood fire, it's usually in a camping environment or smoking outside or something like that. Of course, in all ages of the world, ancient, medieval, and even during the Industrial Revolution, open fires like this would have been used to prepare food inside of a house. And so I kind of want to explore a little bit about that. How practical is it? How does it work? What problems do you run into? The way I'm going to suspend the meat is with wire hooks attached to a grate above the fire. And then I'm going to keep a long, low fire burning underneath for about 6 hours in order to smoke the beef. Quick word of advice, I'm using wires here that I preheated to find out if they're galvanized. You can tell if steel has been galvanized or covered in a zinc layer by its silvery sheen, and then also if you heat it in a fire, then it begins to turn yellow. If that happens, then stop. The galvanization, when it heats up, turns to a poisonous gas, and you don't want that in your house. And there in the fireplace, you have my chunk of soon-to-be pastrami, all spiced up, brined, suspended over these coals for the next 6 hours. And when it comes out, hopefully it will be delicious and not kill me. Oh, I forgot to mention, by the way, this is actually the very first time I've ever smoked anything. So, well, here goes. I'll let you know in 6 hours what happens. Okay, so how did you make this? So we're now about 6 hours, no, excuse me, we're about 5 hours later. So this thing has been in the fireplace for 5 hours. This is my brother Samuel, who has kindly volunteered for the onerous burden of helping me eat this.
I'm ready to sacrifice.
Temperature control was actually really hard. You can see it at the bottom.
Holy cow!
Yeah, the bottom really...
That thing is
had a number done on it.
Cooked.
So
it's more than cooked. It's like...
Yeah.
More than...
So
it's going past charred at this point.
So it turns out that temperature control over a wood fire is like really, really, really hard. But I'm actually really optimistic about the rest of this, except for the very bottom.
That is fantastic. You can tell it's been in salt for a bit.
So that's the thing that I think as I eat it is, first of all, it is incredibly salty. It's very, very salty. Second of all, it's pretty darn good.
Yeah, it's super good. That's funny. It's juicier than I thought it would be. That's incredible. Dude, that is really good, Joseph.
It's not cutting as easily as I would hope. I'm not sure why.
I don't think so. It's a little dry, but it's still very succulent. Obviously, very flavorful.
It's not like dry roast beef where like dry roast beef, it's like eating wood, right? And this is not like eating wood. It's just like, it's ever so slightly dry. That's all. So that is my first smoking adventure. I just made pastrami. We brined it to help preserve it. I'm linking prog powder in the description below, a link to buy your own prog powder so that you can do this. If you do want to do this at home, you do it at your own risk. You know, this can go wrong. Happily, it doesn't seem to have gone wrong for us yet. If we start throwing up in an hour, we'll let you know.
I feel great.
In the video description. So do we just keep eating this forever, or do we end the video?
I'm okay with eating it. I'm okay with eating it. I mean, I'm still seeing meat on the plate, so.
So I'm still my mind is kind of blown by the fact that this sat out in salt water for 3.5 weeks.
Wait, how long? Sorry, what?